Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. So today I want to have a conversation, or start a conversation and a discussion in our community, because it's Muharram, we're in the first few days. It's the beginning of the Islamic New Year, and I don't know about you, when Muharram starts, like all New Years, you take a moment to pause and think about what's going to happen in the coming year, a time to start fresh. And of course, the events of Karbala and Ashura are a great way to focus our minds to think about renewal, revival, and how we take on the challenges that are around us. And there's an interesting paradox I find in Muharram, which is that on the one hand, we want to focus on our inner selves and that inner development that we have. But also, because of the way we talk about Karbala and from the time of the Prophet to the time of Hussein and Yazid, there is a question about the bigger social context and how we as individuals fit into that bigger social context. And so not only should we be thinking about what's happening in our own inner selves, but also how we as individuals fit into that bigger story that is happening around us today. And when we bring those two things together, the question that I'm really asking or posing in this conversation starter is, what is our purpose as Muslims in Britain today? And how do we ensure that we can fulfill that purpose, both for ourselves and as people in the communities that we live in? So what is the purpose? How do we fulfill the purpose? And what do we need? What are the resources and perhaps the changes and the shifts that we require in order to deliver against that purpose? So that's really the framework that I'm setting out for the next 30 minutes or so about what it means to be a Muslim in Britain today. So I think I have this title of Challenges of Being a British Muslim. I'm kind of cramming quite a lot of things into that about how we live as Muslims and what our purpose is going to be in this society. And I think a good way to start framing that for us is to think about the way we talk about Karbala. Because if we think about the stories of the years and the decades after the death of the Prophet, peace be upon him, and moving to Karbala, we talk about the individual journeys. Every night we talk about one of the companions or one of the family, and we see their individual story, and we start to connect whether that individual story relates to me or relates to people around me. But also we think about the structures, the political structures, how people accessed power, who had power, and who was allowed to have it. And we can start asking those same kind of questions that we have today. I mean, we're living in an incredibly emotional, very unusual political time. And actually, these questions about who has power and how we access power, whether it's political or cultural or economic, are very pertinent to all of us today. I think about, what were the attitudes of people at that time? What did they think about the people who were ruling? If you did a YouGov poll at that time, what would their attitudes be about, Yazid in power or Imam Hussein in power? Maybe that's a different kind of lecture for another day. But I think it helps us to understand what are our attitudes to structure and power in societies, and how should we react to those. So these are the two kind of aspects that I want to think about, and then put into that the challenges of being a Muslim. Now, some caveats I should make. I've kept this quite a data-light presentation. So I've put a few statistics in. We need to understand what our communities are going through. But, maybe maybe it's a conversation for a different day or a different kind of structure where we can go through with charts and numbers and things to understand really in detail what Muslim communities in Britain are going through. There is just a little side discussion for those of you who are not familiar, whether we talk about a Muslim community or Muslim communities, that we're not one single thing, that everybody is the same. We do have a great amount of variation, and that's quite important in the conversation too. The second thing I should say is that I don't have any answers for you in this, sorry, but I have a lot of thinking about how we can look at the questions that we need to ask and how we might come to some of those answers. And then finally, I should just say, I know there's a lot of people in the room who know a lot more than I do on many of these subjects. So I present this really as an analysis, my analysis of what's happening in Britain. and from the point of view of the work that I do. And actually, that's part of the conversation. How do we frame the challenges and the issues? And so, many of you will be familiar with my work, but for those who are not, the reason I'm so interested in what it means to be a British Muslim is that this is something that has really been at the front of my mind for 15, 20 years. I wrote my first book about what it was like to be a British Muslim. I wrote my second book, Generation M, about what it's like to be a young Muslim in Britain and around the world. I'm asked to speak to the media about what it means to be a British Muslim, particularly a Muslim woman or young Muslim, around the trend. So this is something that I'm asked to be on the pulse of and to really think about the kind of changes that are happening around us. And for my actual day job, I work at an advertising agency, thinking about the businesses and the corporations and how they can engage with Muslim audiences and what the kind of trends that are shaping Muslim thinking are. So this is really occupying my mind pretty much 24/7, which is why I wanted to put it to the audience and share it with you. So I said not many numbers, but I need to give you a few because we want to get a feeling of the community. So this is very fast. I promise I'm not going to make it really boring, just to give you a kind of flavor of where we are. So in terms of population, if it wasn't Muharram, I would do a Q&A and see how many of you know this. There's around 2.8 million Muslims in the UK. That's from the last census, although Pew Forum would estimate that that has now gone up to about 4 million. And that's around just under 5% of the UK population. Just as a side note, it's quite interesting to know that in polling about what the general population thinks of the number of Muslims, they think there's actually probably around 10 million Muslims in the UK, going up to around 14 by next year. So the number of Muslims that people think are in the UK is wildly overestimated. So there are a lot of Muslims, but not as many as the Daily Mail might like you to think. The other notable factor about Muslims is Muslims are very, very young. So actually if you look at the UK population, around just under 20% are under 15, but for Muslims, that's a third. So Muslims are really, really young, and half of Muslims are under 25. So it's a really, really young population. And if you compare the median age of the general population, it's 40, and for Muslims, it's 25. So Muslim communities are very, very young compared to the general population. And also, there's a much smaller proportion of Muslims that are old in the 65 plus category, although that's increasing, and I'll talk about that a bit later. We do have some health problems, though, that we need to talk about. So, for example, over 65s, Muslims have some of the worst health indicators, particularly amongst Muslim women. So when we get older, all the health problems that have been building up, we have, over-indexing on obesity and diabetes and cardiovascular disease, and literally all the terrible things you can think of are just accumulating in Muslim communities, and those come home to roost at 65 plus, particularly because we don't do a lot of exercise and a lot of sport, and that's highlighted in women in particular. Muslims are very urban, so actually if you want to get to Muslims, just go to one of the 4 big urban conurbations around the country. So London, West Midlands, North West and Yorkshire, and that's about 80% of Muslims. So Muslims try to live very close together, and particularly in those built-up areas. In the UK, often people confuse Muslim for being subcontinental, Pakistani, Indian or Bangladeshi. And while around 2/3 of Muslims are from the subcontinent, the number who are from other ethnicities is actually growing. So that's actually something we need to be mindful of, that we're an incredibly diverse population, and we're becoming increasingly more so, partly due to refugees arriving in the UK, partly due to conversion, English Muslims, and just a general kind of influx. So actually we need to think about this growing ethnic diversity that's shifting the UK Muslim population. And then just a couple of more before you nod off after a hard day's work. I'm really interested in some of the economics around Muslim populations. So actually Muslims have much lower employment rates than any other community, and actually also earn per hour less than any other community as well. So if you add that up, Muslims really economically are in a much weaker position than other communities. compared to religious and non-religious groups. There's all sorts of numbers that you can refer to. And the one that also caught my eye, which I think is very interesting, is median household wealth. So how much wealth does a particular household have is the lowest for Muslim groups compared to any other. So actually the wealth that we're accumulating as Muslims in the UK is very low. Now, partly that's because it's by ethnicity. So you find that African Caribbeans have very low household wealth, and so do Bangladeshi communities. But nonetheless, overall, as a Muslim population, our wealth, the assets we have are very low. And that's something I think we need to think about quite seriously about how we change that. Because when you add that, and I'll come on to talk about this in a second, when you add that to things like poor access to resources, poor access to economics, poor access to health, education, power, and jobs, that starts to have quite a detrimental effect. And included in that is Muslims are much more likely to rely on benefits than non-Muslims, showing that we need to build up those kind of resources and that ability to get into that employment ladder. And the other one I just wanted to highlight is that for Muslims, religion is really, really important. So around 94% of Muslims say that being Muslim is either very or extremely important, which is way above any other group that talks about its own religious identity. And actually, Muslims are also very proud to be British. So actually, they over-index compared to the general population on how proud they are to be British. So you've got these two really interesting factors coming through, that Muslims are very Muslim, I could put it like that, and also very British. And yet that's not the way that Muslims either are talked about, or in fact we talk about ourselves, that we really take pride in everything that we do, and we really want to do it well and kind of max it out. So that's a very, very quick overview, just trying to paint a picture of what our demographics are looking like, what our economics are looking like, what our diversity is looking like, and the kind of challenges we have. There's a lot more detail. If you want to have a look, a really great study is by Ipsos Mori. They did a review of all the studies out there on Muslims in the UK, so that's a really good reference point. Okay, so that's the statistics. What I want to talk about is kind of the real challenges, some of the topics that we need to think about. And because it's part of my job to have a pulse on how people are feeling, I did a very unscientific poll on social media, just asking Muslims what they feel are their biggest challenges. And some of the findings, none of the details particularly surprised me, but I was surprised at the way that the question was approached. So they said, it's education, marriage, drugs, schooling, socializing, being around alcohol, helping children to stay away from haram, how to have halal fun, how to avoid judging other people, the pressure to integrate versus the pressure to keep your own identity, even things like mispronouncing your name or asking you constantly where you're from. And what really struck me about the way that people answered the question I posed, bear in mind, this is not kind of survey rigorous or authentic, but I just thought it was quite interesting that there were two things that came out to me. The first one was that people replied very quickly. I got lots of answers very fast, and sometimes when I post questions I get no responses, and sometimes I get a few. And what this told me was that people really want to talk about what their challenges are. People are waiting for spaces where they can express the things that are difficult for them and see if there are answers, or can other people help them. And they're very much on an individual level. So these were things about your daily life, about how you go to school, how you help your children, how you overcome those everyday individual challenges in your daily life. And that for me was also quite interesting, because sitting where I do, and perhaps many of you do, and reading the newspapers and watching the TV, sometimes it can feel like the biggest challenge we have is counterterrorism or prevent or security or Islamophobia, all of which are very important and I will mention. But it feels like people are actually saying that, how do I just deal with my life? And how do I reach the purpose that I'm seeking in my daily life? And I think that's something we need to think about in the responses we give to how do we address these challenges. So what I want to do now is, and this is where I want to lay the groundwork for thinking about purpose and how do we reach our purpose, is that I've looked at a number of trends, and this is my analysis of where I think the British Muslim community is, and there'll be lots of other analysis that can be done. And I think there's kind of 6 broad areas that are really shifting in the way that Muslim communities have changed over the last 50, 60, 70 years. And I think we need to be really aware of what those changes are and think about what the impact of those will be, and therefore how we can fulfill the goals that we are setting ourselves. So those are age, economics, diversity, gender, social change, and community. It's not as boring as it sounds. And there are some quite interesting things. So as I go through these, and I'm going to just kind of paint a picture of them, I want us to start thinking about, what are these challenges throwing up to us? How do they affect me in my daily life? As I said, a lot of people are saying that these are individual daily challenges that we're going through. And just because we are talking at a meta level, or I'm sitting and speaking to you, doesn't mean that individually we're not experiencing these things. And I think that's important for us to recognize that we are affected by all of these things as much as anybody else. And what are the challenges that it's putting up, and therefore how are we going to solve them? Not just for ourselves. I'll give you a kind of spoiler for the end. How do we solve some of these for the wider societies and communities that we're living in part of? What does it mean to be a Muslim in Britain? And how do we fulfill our role as Muslims? So thinking about age and changing demographics, one of the biggest shifts that I see, particularly in my work, is that we're starting to see younger generations of Muslims. So Muslims are very young, I mentioned that, but also the attitudes and the feeling and the identity of being Muslim as second, third, even fourth generation is quite different to how, when people arrived, and the vast majority of Muslims in the UK are immigrants, that feeling of being a first or even a second generation. So when you look at, as I've called them, Generation M, so young Muslims who really feel very comfortable being British and Muslim, and the sense of having a right to exist here and to own it and to have as much share in the country as anyone else, and the way that they see their own Muslim identity and practice it can be quite different, and that is leading to quite a lot of generational struggle. And I think we need to start thinking about what does it mean? How do you practice Islam? What does it mean to be Muslim? What does a young Muslim look like, dress like, eat like, socialize like, compared to older generations? And how do we navigate that change? And this is particularly important because although the Muslim population has a very small older population, it's actually growing. So we're going to start to see quite significant numbers of older Muslims in that 65 plus arena. How do we care for them? What does it mean to look after them? What are their needs going to be? And somehow at the same time, we also have this disproportionately large younger population. So how are we going to balance their needs and engage with both of those groups? Particularly if in a general discourse, there's something called the sandwich. The group in the middle are trying to look after older and younger, and both are growing in numbers. So those are some things we need to think about, and also in terms of health and wellness. So can we help older populations? How do we set great attitudes for younger children so that we put our communities on a good course? So I think changing the generational shift is going to be quite significant and quite impactful. In terms of economics and resources, so I talked about some of the challenges that we already have in terms of economics. So we're one of the least wealthiest communities. There is obviously divergence depending on ethnicity. But also Muslims live in some of the poorest areas in the country. They have some of the most deprivation and the least access to resources. So we're getting stuck. And we know that wider population is also having that challenge. So if you're not in the elite, you're more likely to become poorer and poorer. And yet there's this interesting flag. Muslims are the most charitable of all the communities. So in polls, they tend to show that even though Muslims are very poor, they give a lot of money. So where is this money going? What are we doing with it? Is it being reinvested into our communities? How do we make the most of it? And perhaps the most interesting for me, and it's quite interesting talking about it here in Mahfil, in kind of a nice affluent suburb of northwest London, is that I think we often think about Muslims as one economic class or one political class, a working class, often affiliated to the Labour Party. And actually, I think what is already happening and will become a bigger shift is we're going to start to see the rise of a much bigger Muslim middle class, which is very distinct from a Muslim working class. And I think one of the things I'm certainly conscious of, and we should have this discussion, is that as representatives, spokespeople, people talking about Muslim needs in the wider community, there is going to come a point where actually people who are Muslim middle class will no longer be representative on many issues for a Muslim working class, because actually we just simply won't have that experience to be able to share with them. And we have to be mindful of that when we're talking about Muslim identities or Muslim identity in the political space. And one of the things that really brought it home for me is when the awful events of Grenfell happened, and there were a lot of Muslims who lived in that tower and were lost. And it was incredible to see the way the mosques and Muslim charities rallied around it. But actually, honestly, speaking for myself, the experiences of Muslims living in that were just beyond the realm of my experience. And, there was nothing that I could have commented on that, because there was nothing I had, even as a media spokesperson on behalf of Muslims, as somebody who is now benefiting from, great education, a stable job, living in an area like this. And I think that's something we're going to start to see a big shift in, and it's already also trickling over into some of the political discourse. So as I said, typically immigrant communities, black minority ethnic communities, Muslims tended to vote on the left, and actually we're starting to see a shift now to the right as well, and we have to be mindful that there's going to be this variation in how we deal with that. Okay, so related to that, there's a shift around diversity. So I was talking about how ethnicity is changing, and actually for young Muslims, ethnicity seems to be, at least on the surface of it, less important than it has been for older generations. So are we going to start to see a kind of smoothing out of Muslim connections across ethnicity? I don't know. But equally, we seem to have a rise of discussion around things like racism within the Muslim community and anti-blackness. So is there a problem, even though we have all this ethnicity in the Muslim communities, that actually it's going to start to divide on race terms? And how do we deal with that? We talk a lot about Muslims, there's no color, there's no, race, there's no background, and yet actually this is a huge problem that we are facing. Particularly young Muslims, young black Muslims are saying that they're not finding the Muslim communities very welcoming. And I think that also applies to people who are coming into Islam who might be what we would describe as white English as well, feeling excluded from Muslim communities. And the final one, which is also very challenging and really comes to the fore when we're in a period like this in Muharram, which is around the diversity of religious expression, the kind of theologies we have, the kind of sectarianism that's coming through. And it's great to be diverse and to have all that in this country, but actually the question is, how do we manage it? How do we have those relationships? Because actually it feels like it's getting tense again, and we need to find ways to address that. Now, turning to a slightly different subject, might feel a little bit more individual. Many of you will know, I think, quite a lot about gender. So what does it mean in terms of gender relation? And actually, one of the things I would like to put on the table as a big challenge and a big shift is, what are the different experiences of Muslim men and Muslim women? Because I think we kind of skirt around this, but actually the experiences of being Muslim are quite different if you're a man and if you're a woman. I know it sounds really obvious, but in the UK, when you think about what is it like to wear hijab, what is it like to go out as a man with a rucksack and a beard, what is it like when you're in the workplace? Is it easier or more difficult? I don't think there's any simple answers, but we should be talking about these dual experiences and how they affect us. And not just out in public, but also in our homes, in our communities. How do we make sure that both are receiving the kind of resources they need? And how do we make sure that nobody is feeling excluded? So in many ways, we see that Muslim women are excelling. So we see Muslim women are achieving better at school, at university, perhaps even in employment. But actually, in terms of having their voices heard in the communities, they're saying that they're struggling, they're feeling judged. These are things that need to be discussed. And that goes into kind of marriage as well. So there's lots of conversations about how do we help people get married? What are women and men's expectations? How do you bring people together? And we see rising divorce rates. The kind of households that we have are changing. There's, many more single households. So how do we try and support and understand that kind of stability? These are really important kind of daily individual questions that we have. And some of those questions around gender and family are starting to be imposed on us, or starting to kind of come from social changes. So we have things like the campaign around No Outsiders. So how do we deal with the conversations around family, around gender fluidity, around relationships? Those are questions that are going to come into this discourse as well. And finally, just thinking about the community, what is there a new definition of community? So one of the things that I notice in my work is that online communities have become really big. So a lot of young Muslims are actually going online to find their communities. And I haven't seen a trend like this in the UK yet, but in the US there is a phenomenon that's been called unmosqued. So people who actually feel like the mosque is no longer for them because it simply doesn't welcome them, doesn't include them, particularly women feel that, so they say they're unmosqued. And we see online things like virtual mosques, the rise of Islamic lectures. So there is a question of, what does our small, immediate community mean? What does it offer? Where are people going for that sense of belonging? Is it built around the mosque? Is it built around ethnicity in a different way? And is the mosque delivering the community feeling that it needs to? So these are kind of big questions. And when we think about Muslim communities in the UK, what's our relationship to communities in other countries? So are we connected to European Muslim communities? Are we connected to North American Muslim communities? Are we being influenced by Muslim populations, for example, in the Middle East, Saudi Arabia, Iran, Kuwait, Qatar, UAE, or Pakistan, some of the traditional Muslim countries? What is the relationship we have with them? Are they part of our community? Are we part of theirs? I don't think there's any right or wrong answers, but I think as we start to build up capital as Muslims in Britain, these are the kind of questions we need to ask ourselves. I mean, one of the things that people will ask is there a British Islam? Should there be a British Islam or not? Is it just something that naturally evolves? So if you go to Indonesia or India or Pakistan or China, everybody has a kind of their own feeling of being Muslim. It's different. Are we going to have the same here? We're quite young, or, these are questions that we need to start thinking about. And one of the other things I've noticed in terms of community, and just kind of keep this in your mind to when I talk about purpose at the end, is what does it mean to do interfaith and intrafaith? Because there's quite a lot of initiatives that we have in terms of building communities, and we really need those alliances. They're really, really important, particularly when we're thinking about our purpose. But how do we build those communities? What is the point of them? And how do we make sure that we're aligned with their goals? And I noticed in particular that there was a period where Muslim identity has really come to the fore. Some might say it kind of triggered with the Salman Rushdie affair. Some might say it started with 9/11 or July 7th. But actually, for younger Muslims, I see a shift now when they're talking about social justice issues. So Black Lives Matter, racism, poverty, climate change, which I'll come on to again in a second. But it's more issues around their Muslimness, their Islam is inspiring them to think about social justice in the way that perhaps we might think about Malcolm X or Muhammad Ali in his period. So is there a shift in the way young people are going to express what it means to be Muslim and how they contribute to the societies around them in a way that perhaps people who have lived here longer might find uncomfortable? Are those kind of alliances going to be difficult? And then finally, I talked about them right at the beginning, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time on them. There's obviously a social backdrop. We have Islamophobia rising again, racism rising again, scrutiny on Muslim women rising again. We also have things like, the rise of post-colonial discourse and, the effect that global rising racism is having on us. And issues around, how do we create culture? Do we have any hook into the way that people talk about us and the way that we can influence the stories around us? And even things like, this idea of the clash of civilization. So there was a study recently where 1/3 of Britons think that Islam is a threat to the British way of life, and those numbers are going up every time that they are polled. So we have this quite difficult social backdrop that we are dealing with. So I'll take a little moment so you can digest all of that. there's a lot for us to think about. And one of the things I'm conscious of is that a 30-minute lecture isn't going to do justice to all of that. But I feel like we need to stop and pause and think about the world we live in, and rather than just kind of going daily life, and just think about what we want to achieve and set our goals on that individually and as a community. And one of the questions that I posed right at the beginning that I was thinking about is that when we're setting our own purpose, when we're thinking about this is Muharram, this is the beginning of the year, we're focusing on the events of Karbala and how that really kind of makes you think about that final goal, and then we think about the structures that we live within. What exactly does it mean to be a Muslim in Britain today? What exactly is our purpose for the communities, all the communities that I defined, and how do we deliver against that purpose? So it might be an individual purpose, that's totally fine. But it does feel like when we're sitting here and we're talking about the Prophet, peace be upon him, and we're talking about Imam Hussein, his grandson, and justice and oppression, it kind of feels like a natural thing to say, what is the point of us? What are we here for? And what are we contributing to the society that we are part of? And that's quite difficult because on the one hand, there are some real challenges that we are facing as Muslims. So we have these structural issues. We have, poverty. We have economic inequality. We have health, education, politics, power, employment. All of these things on every indicator, generally, very broad sweep, Muslims are really struggling in the UK. Plus, we have Islamophobia and racism to deal with. So there are things that we need, and it's important that we talk about those things that we need and that we have a right to access them. But beyond that, we also need to think about what is the point of us? Speaking entirely for myself, the reason to be Muslim is that Islam has something to offer, that being Muslim has a net contribution to the world that we live in. So what is that? And how do we fulfill that, living in a society, especially where we have many of those challenges? And there are some really big ones that I haven't mentioned. So we live in a society where the nuns, I don't know if you've seen these studies, the people who believe in no religion at all and no God actually now exceed all other religions, including Christianity. So we have the rise of the nuns. We have a changing ethical framework. So we're thinking about, how does death operate? How does gender operate? How are relationships operating? Really big issues like climate change. As Muslims, and I hang my head in shame about myself. As Muslims, climate change is really something that we can lead on. I mean, we are the stewards of the earth. We're here to preserve it. We're here to make sure people get paid fairly, that resources are sustainable, that we think about the way that we consume and dispose of. And what about poverty? How do we tackle poverty? Not just ours, but we see rising poverty, rising food banks, rising people really struggling day to day. What can we do as Muslims to make all of these things better, inspired by the fact that we are Muslim, despite the fact that we have all these own challenges? So this is kind of my presentation, my analysis of the challenges, which might feel quite big. And I think sometimes we have to make sure we're just doing them on an individual basis. But this is the challenge facing us. What is our purpose? Why are we here? And what, inspired by being Muslim, can we do given the kind of challenges that we have as British Muslims? And by way of food for thought, just to kind of close, I wanted to just quote something that Imam Hussein said by way of purpose. And this is a quote from Muhammad the Hanafiya about when Imam Hussein was leaving Medina, which on the journey that would eventually take him to Karbala. And Imam Hussein says, "I do not exit Medina for evilness, oppression, or corruption. Surely I leave Medina for reforming the affairs of my grandfather's ummah. I want to enjoin good and forbid evil and follow the tradition of the Messenger of Allah and my father." So that's Imam Hussein's purpose, reforming the affairs of my grandfather's ummah and enjoining good and forbidding evil in the tradition of the Prophet and Imam Ali. So in the footsteps of the Prophet and Imam Hussein, may Allah grant us the ability to fulfill that purpose and to shine light on what is good and to make things better, not just for ourselves, but for all of those we live amongst. Wassalamu alaikum.
We have some time for questions now, if there are any.
Shelina, thank you for that. It's something which has been puzzling me for some time now. As you said rightly, that society is becoming a-religious, if you like. They are not, or majority are not identifying with any particular religion. But then why should that majority despise Muslims as a religious minority? If they are not religious, what is their problem with? I mean, I could understand the Christianity and Islam confrontation, like the Crusades and things. There was motivation on both sides. But here, it seems to me either racism is bound into Islamophobia, which there is a little bit, but this is a puzzling question of why should this happen?
There is a puzzle to unpack, and I think, I mean, my first instinct to think about that is when you look particularly at younger generations, one of the things that's on the mind, and if you want to go and have a look, they're called kind of, Gen Z and Gen K even, they're getting younger and younger, is actually what they're really keen on is lack of judgment and respect and kind of embracing all difference. So actually, when you look at the kind of things they talk about, they want people to be accepted irrespective of race, irrespective of religion, irrespective of gender, irrespective of background. So we have one trend which is around, just let everybody be who they are. And that's quite a young trend. But we do see other trends, new atheism kind of taking, a very hard line against Muslims. And I think we see this rise of kind of racism that's happening at a wider level. So I don't think there's an easy answer to that. I think what's quite interesting is thinking about how Muslims can address that. And one of the things that is required, which I guess I was alluding to, is thinking about what we can offer that conversation about being all embracing, about being all inclusive, around that kind of social justice. I mean, one of the really interesting things I think, and it's not necessarily related to being Muslim, but was a very interesting political trigger, was when Tahrir Square happened and they had the revolution in Egypt. That actually is what triggered Wall Street. And I forget, sorry, my mind has gone. One of you probably remember the 99 and the Occupy Wall Street, thank you. And that was quite interesting to me, that what Muslims had done in Egypt, not necessarily specifically because they were Muslim, but a Muslim population had done that, had actually triggered a different kind of social justice movement in really the heart of a country that, doesn't seem to care particularly about Muslims. So I think those are the kind of places that we can tackle those divides that are going up, like that ordinary human importance that everybody has in their life.
Any questions from the ladies' side? Okay, I guess we'll finish there. Can we have a last salawat, please?
As long as the organisers are okay.
Well, thank you very much for that. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Thank you very much for that subject. Quite thought-provoking subject to talk about. You've mentioned the statistics of that Muslims counts to about 5% of the population of UK. Now, is it 5% everywhere across every sector in UK in terms of work positions, wealth, power, etc., etc.? I doubt it very much, but you're going to tell me that. And if it isn't that the case, do you think that there's few drawbacks that hold us back? For example, because we are Muslims, we are simple, we are in our nature being Muslims. In other words, we don't have the aggression and maybe other if you like, faction of society or other religions may have? Or is it because of our simplicity and that goes stretched to as far as maybe education, the lack of education? No. Most of the countries that we come from are well educated, so that's why we are, if you like, where we are, the third world countries. Or is it because of the external forces that we surrounded by, which is, if you like, the discrimination and so on? So it's a two-part questions. I want to know the 5% and I want to know the answer to the second part if you can, please. Thanks.
So the 5% is obviously just a share of the population, 2.8 million versus whatever the population was when the census was done. I mean, one of the things that we know is that Muslims are underrepresented in, wealth, in politics. I mean, my particular area of interest is things like culture, so arts, news, media, advertising, branding, design, all of the kind of cultural sectors. And I know that in all of those, Muslims are hugely underrepresented. And that goes generally for BAME communities, but particularly Muslims. When I look around the sectors that I work in, I mean, literally, if I see a Muslim, I run up to them and hug them, not the man, but just, it's very rare and it's very exciting. And my personal interest is that those are places where culture and stories and narrative are told, and therefore we should make sure we are better represented. And actually, it's a long game. You can't change it overnight. It's a 20-year project. And so some of the challenges, I mean, you laid out the challenges pretty much accurately. Some of the challenges are from within Muslim communities. So if, for example, we want more journalists and more designers and more news presenters and more people creating advertising, then that means students need to go to university and then they need to take on those jobs, which is not something that Muslim communities, particularly as immigrant communities, have naturally had an affinity to. But that's understandable. People want stable jobs. And they're like, my mom is here. I'm not sure she knows exactly what I do, but that's all right. And a lot of young people will say, I want to do this job. What does this job do? Nobody really knows, but, it pays a good wage, so that's fine. So I think there are some issues around role models as well, who can go and do those jobs. And then there are structural issues. So we know that if your name is Muslim, you're less likely to get an interview. We know that you're less likely to get a job. We know that you're less likely to progress. We know that you're going to have an ethnicity pay gap. So there are all these additional barriers. But actually, your questions are a whole lecture in themselves, or perhaps a half day. But there are issues that as Muslims in our communities we need to deal with, and there are structural issues that actually we need to dismantle in order to allow Muslims to progress. Any others before I get up? Yeah.
I'm sorry, my English is not rich enough to make my questions, but did your study analysis the background of people running mosques in England, for example, and in our community as a Shia? What the difference between who fund this is centers like a Sistani Center or here or Stanmore, and who fund them and what the goals of them? Who set up their objectives?
This is a great title for the lecture you're going to give next week, I'm sure.
Do you know what I mean? Do you know the influence of our politics countries where we came to here, on our centers? For example, I'm a Sistani or I am Khamenei. What the objectives? Why Stanmore, the Imam Jama'ah of Stanmore, how his khutbah, what objectives of each Friday khutbah? This is very important, I think, and need to analyze.
I'm hoping that organisers are busy writing this down, because that is a whole separate subject.
Assalamu alaikum. Quick question. When you said BME communities are underrepresented in media, journalism, to what extent is that burden of representation on women? Because women are more visible as minorities, as hijabis. So do you think it is that burden of representation is on women more than men?
Okay, so when I said representation, I mean people who actually work in those sectors. Is that what you meant? Yeah. Okay. So that's a general statistic. I don't have the numbers here, but that's a general statistic for BAME communities in those sectors. So it doesn't look at whether it's men or women. There's probably analysis that, but generally we know overall there are just less people from BAME backgrounds. And within that, Muslims, I mean, we don't often have data specifically about Muslims, so that's quite in itself an issue. But because in the UK, most Muslims are from BAME backgrounds, it's not a very accurate analysis, but you can make an assumption that that also applies to Muslims. And then anecdotally, if you talk to people like me or others, they'll tell you that Muslims are even less represented. I don't know whether it's more or less affecting men or women. And when I was talking about the different experiences that men and women have, and I think the workplace is a particularly challenging one. I think it would be interesting to see whether it's easier or more difficult for Muslim men or women, because on the one hand, and the organizer should tell me to stop when we've run out of time. On the one hand, there are a lot of initiatives to try and get more women into the workplace. So sometimes actually Muslim women can benefit from that, and they should. So make sure you're all applying. Take advantage of every opportunity that's available. So sometimes that can actually benefit women. On the other hand, sometimes it's easier for men to kind of just, kind of pass through without being too noticed. On the other hand, I think sometimes the experience of being in the workplace, if you're a woman, particularly if you cover, may actually be easier because people just kind of know that you're not going to go out drinking or you're not going to socialize in a particular way, which can be a lot harder for men who maybe have to make a point of it. So I don't know the answer to that. All I know is that there are lots of things that distinguish the experience of men and women, and actually we need to understand what they are. And I don't think we can generalize and say, it's harder for women because they wear hijab, or it's harder for men because they can't do X or Y. I think we need to understand that a bit better.
Okay, thank you very much for your talk. I think we'll end there. Salawat.